All right, so this is session number 5 of You Don't Get It, the study of Mark that we're doing, and this one is really on the theme of You Don't Get an Easy Life. And so the icebreaker question that I've been asking at the beginning of these questions this week is that if someone were to ask you, who do you say Jesus is, how would you answer that question? Because that question becomes the kind of the theme of the verses we'll look at, some of the verses we'll look at today. And we'll look at that. We've looked at Mark. And we talked about the what we call the primacy of Mark. That Mark was the first gospel probably written, and that Matthew and Luke wrote their gospels using Mark and possibly another source that we call Q for how their gospels were written a decade or two later, and then that John was the third gospel, and John is different because it's not like the other ones. We always call John kind of more a theological gospel, but the thing I always say is that all the gospels are theological because the stories you tell and the way you tell stories says a lot about your theology. That's kind of how we deal with theology. It's not it's like the ways you tell stories as a family help kind of define how your family works and how that family works, and any story we tell and the story we decide is the most important are going to be the stories that we're going to say are going to say a lot about who we understand God to be and how we understand God to work with us. So that they become our theology as well. And so the stories in Mark become kind of Mark's way of stating his theology of this is why it's important for us to hear what Jesus did in this situation or in that situation, and it becomes a way in which he tells us a little about who Jesus is, even though throughout the stories that Mark tells, there's this recurring theme of people not quite understanding what Jesus is trying to say. And as we talked a little about in the last session, we talked about how there's an ease of looking back through the lens of the resurrection and the couple thousand years of Christianity and kind of knowing, well, that makes sense now, but it didn't make sense at the time when you're experiencing it right now as one of the disciples who was living and working and walking around and eating and spending time with Jesus. So we're going to read, and this time it comes, we started in chapter 8. 8 to 10 is kind of where we're going to spend our time today. And then next week, we'll kind of wrap up Mark's Gospel with kind of where we go with that. But this is starting in chapter 8, verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went in to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." Now, those are the kind of the big kind of understanding of things is that it seems kind of weird. Why is this guy coming back? It's almost like, is this a reincarnation kind of thing, or what's going on here? How is this working? And it's less. I'm actually that physical person as I'm in this way of the school of kind of thought and kind of way of thing. This is a little bit of both. It's a little bit kind of interesting there, but some say you're John the Baptist. Well, he can't be John the Baptist because John the Baptist is his cousin, and John the Baptist, they met John the Baptist. Some of the disciples who were with Jesus came from following John the Baptist to following Jesus. Some say Elijah. Elijah, again, was the prophet, one of the great prophets and major prophets. But Elijah, there's this idea that Elijah was kind of assumed into heaven, and kind of there's no kind of the story of kind of this stuff and all this stuff, and it's just kind of weird kind of thing. And still Elijah's just one of the other prophets. There's something else going on here. So that's what other people are trying to figure out about Jesus. They don't get it. They're trying to figure it out. Who do you say that I am? Jesus asked. And Peter answered, "You are the Christ." And Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone. So it's not like, I want you to get this, Jesus kind of seems to think, without having to be exactly explained to you and stated to you clearly. Notice here that in this question, there's not any kind of, you are the rock, and on this I'm going to build the church and all that kind of stuff. That stuff's added into the other Gospels, but not here. Mark's just kind of, again, just the facts, just kind of the basics of the story. So then Jesus began to teach his disciples out of this. the human one, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the legal experts, and be killed, and then after 3 days rise from the dead. He said this plainly, but Peter took a hold of Jesus and scolding him and began to correct him. We don't talk like that. Come on, we don't talk about dying, and we don't talk about that. And if you are the Messiah, like I said you are, then that's not what's going to happen. That's not what's supposed to happen. That's not the plan that we've always been taught as people who studied God's Word. And then Jesus turned and looked at his disciples and then sternly corrected Peter. Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts. Now, this kind of way of talking, it seems kind of weird and not quite understanding. I had a difficult relationship with a certain member of a church where I was pastoring. He didn't necessarily agree with how I handled the situation that he wanted me to get involved in. It wasn't really my purview to get involved in, and he thought I hadn't gone far enough, and so he lodged a complaint, which happens. And there's a way to do that, and he lodged a complaint with our staff parish, and they saw things, and then he called my district superintendent, and the district superintendent came out to meet, and everything else. So we're sitting around this room and having this conversation about this, and he was asking me a question, and they were asking me for my take on it, and I was explaining it. And the guy stood up and looked at me and put his hand out and said, "Get behind me, Satan." So he called me Satan. And I was kind of like, whoa, okay, this gets a little strange. And I wasn't expecting that. So what did I text one of my best friends, who's a pastor up in Louisville, who we went to seminary together. We were good friends for a long time. And I said, Eric, I said, you're never going to believe this. This is what happened. Somebody in my church just called me Satan. And his response, his only a good friend response, was, "How did they find out?" So that's where it goes. So there's this idea that but it's not that he's calling Peter Satan. He's really just kind of stating that these are impure thoughts, these are temptations, these are things to not give myself over. Think about Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane and that story that happens in the Gospels, different narratives. It's this idea where Jesus is praying this prayer, not my will, but yours be done. It's almost this idea of the human side of Jesus even wanting to resist the temptation to give himself completely to God's will. And so he didn't want, in this situation, almost the temptation was, we won't do this. Well, we won't let that happen to you, and that's not the way it happens, and we should, don't talk like that, Jesus. And so he kind of challenges to do that. This section kind of marks a turning point in this story, because Peter declares Jesus to be the Messiah, but then he kind of immediately rebukes the teaching. It's almost like Peter almost gets it, but not really. I almost get it. Yeah, you're the Messiah, but not really what that means. I don't really understand it. And then Jesus kind of starts to outline the nature of discipleship and the rest of this thing, and talking about what that means. He continues to teach his disciple. He reminds them of how he has provided for them in the past, of all the great things he's done, of how he's been there for them, and then questions their lack of complete trust in him. And so I think that's it. Jesus has, in Mark's gospel and other gospels, heals physical blindness, but I think he's also seeking to open up our eyes of faith so that we can see him as the Christ, the Messiah. And I think it's the challenge to see what Jesus really is, and then he reminds us that there's a cost to really getting it, to really understanding it, which makes it, I think, even more difficult for these disciples at the time to even want to get it, much less get it, and makes it harder for people on the outside. There's a story in the Gospels as a whole that talks about where Jesus starts talking about things, and the crowd starts to disperse, and Jesus looks at his disciples and where did everybody go? They say, "Man, this is really hard. What you're teaching us is really hard, and people just aren't ready for this." And he says, "Why did you go?" And disciples say, well, you alone have the words of life. And I think that's a great way of kind of understanding that I don't really get it, Jesus, but you alone seem to have the answer to some of these questions I'm asking, and I just want to know this. So as Peter shares who he begins to understand who Jesus is, Jesus then kind of shares with his disciples about his impending death and how this is God's will for them. And then the story kind of goes on from there. He calls the crowd together with the disciples, and Jesus said to them, all who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives will because of me and the good news of them. Why would people gain the whole world but lose their lives? What will people give in exchange for their lives? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this unfaithful and sinful generation, the human one will be ashamed of that person when it comes in the Father's glory with the holy angels. So the idea here of that Jesus kind of lays out for having faith in Jesus. We kind of talk about, nowhere in the Bible does it talk about saying the sinner's prayer or doing kind of those kind of responses to becoming a Christian. But Jesus kind of lays out this steps for discipleship, for following him, as an idea of being able to deny myself and be for someone else, to be thinking about someone else first. And then he says that it's an idea of not only just believing and getting who I am, it's not being ashamed of that. And there's an idea, some sense in which I think ways in which when we get the full message of Jesus, no matter which side of a discussion we may come down on, there's ways in which, I don't like that about Jesus. There's a Christmas story that's told about a Victorian queen who built this really ornate kind of cathedral and all this stuff and gold inlays and all this kind of stuff. And the priest started to criticize her and say, this is not really that. Think about the humble beginnings of Jesus, born in a manger and born in this humble kind of thing, and that's who Jesus is. And she says, yes, I know, and that's one of the things I've never liked about him. I mean, that's kind of, we kind of have some of that stuff that's, yes, I know that's who Jesus is, but that's not something I really like about Jesus, so we don't stress that part of it. And so we've talked a little bit in this study about how the different brands of Christianity and how they kind of relate to each other and what that means and how there's a truth that's at the heart of all of them, and there's different ways of kind of living that truth out. This idea that there's just this sense in which there's one brand of Christianity that says we are the full gospel church. And I always wonder, are you really the full gospel? Because the full gospel gets in a lot of trouble, and it doesn't let you get easy answers to hard questions. And that's the part of it that I think we struggle with. That we're not always full gospel people. We only like I like this part of the gospel, or I like this part of the gospel, or I stress this, or I stress that, and to really stress the whole of it really puts us in a lot of difficult decisions, and it makes it hard for us to side with any one group of people all the time. It really struggles us to do that, and that's why it's I always say Christianity. Discipleship, Christianity, understanding discipleship it's a political thing, but it's its own brand of politics. It's not, you can't go to this side, you can't go to this side, you got to stay. It's a different animal altogether, and that's what makes it so hard to kind of sometimes get along with some of the things that go along in this world. So in chapter 9, Jesus continues, I assure you that some standing here won't die before they see God's kingdom arrive in power. Now, that causes problems right there. Some of these people won't die. Well, obviously they did. They all died because it didn't happen within the next 30 to 60 to 90 years, right? It's been 2,000 years. It's been a long time. And I think what we realize quickly is that it's a thing that I think caused problems for people, but I think it's also an expectation that the early church had, that it would not be a long time.
Good question.
Yes.
I've thought about that. Is he really talking about God's kingdom arriving in power about Pentecost, actually?
Yeah, I think that's more but that's not the way it's often interpreted.
Right.
That's what I was going to say. I think that's more the answer to what he's talking about here, is that you're going to see God's kingdom come, and you're going to see it show up in power, and you're going to be blown away by this. In other words, there's other times when the Gospels say, when they say, Jesus, we don't want you to go away. And he goes, no, you don't understand. If I don't go away, and you don't get the Holy Spirit, and you don't get to see what really this thing is all about. You get to get even more than you think you're not getting now. When you get that, it's going to be even more amazing. And I think that's probably more what he's talking about, instead of. But for the early church, it was this idea that that wasn't the real understanding of it. Paul struggled with that in a couple of places he writes, and other early Christian writers did. It was this idea that Jesus was going to come back soon. But I think he's in this. Seeing where Mark writing it, I think Mark is talking more about the Pentecost story. And then we get the Transfiguration. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and brought them to the top of a very high mountain where they were alone. Now, I think it's also interesting that it's 6 days later. So it's almost like, if we think about the timing of this, Mark doesn't give details to stories, right? It's very general, not a lot of details. So if he's giving us this 6 days later, it's almost like this story of I assure you happens in a Sabbath kind of setting. And 6 days later, they go up on the mountaintop, happens, if it's not, then so it's almost like why is that detail there for Mark? It's almost like this becomes, there's some Sabbath kind of understanding behind there. So 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and brought them to the top of a very high mountain, and they were alone. He transformed in front of them, and his clothes were amazingly bright, brighter than if they'd been bleached white. Elijah and Moses appeared and were talking with Jesus. Peter reacted to all of this by saying to Jesus, Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Let's make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He said this because he didn't know how to respond, for the 3 of them were terrified. Now, here's the other thing I'll say, right here. So Peter almost gets it. You're the Messiah. Doesn't quite get it. Don't say you're going to die. And then he gets taken up on this mountaintop, for this mountain where he's transformed or transfigured right there. And then he says this, let's build three booths so we can stay here forever. He said this because he didn't know how to respond, because he didn't get it. He didn't understand. He didn't really understand what this really meant. They were terrified of this. Why wouldn't you be, right? I mean, this is an amazing thing. You've got Moses and Elijah who were long dead kind of prophets, and now they're up there standing there talking to Jesus. And what does that mean? I think that's an interesting thing. We were talking around the office yesterday, some of us, about something called thin places. I don't know if you've ever heard people talk about thin places, but thin places are ways that the early church fathers especially used to talk about places you go where the veil between heaven and earth is kind of thin, where you almost can see some stuff. And we were talking about it in terms of someone in the midst of dying, and sometimes there's a thin place that happens in that where they kind of see and seem to experience kind of almost like, there's my mom who's been dead for 20 years, and yet I'm having a conversation with them. Or sanctuaries are often considered thin places, or there's other places where we go that we've been. For me, one of those places is if you've ever been to Lake Junaluska, you go up there and there's this cross that's up on the mountaintop that's lit, and sitting there, kind of I've had experiences there. It's just kind of a thin place for me. There's different places like that around that we have, and I think when Mark talks about the details of going up on the mountaintop, on the high mountain, it's less about, in that culture, that would have been very height would have been important for this kind of story. But I think it's this idea that we're going up where there's a thin place between between what's going on. That's why you can see Moses and Elijah having conversations with them. They're there, and it says, then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice spoke from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I dearly love. Listen to him." And suddenly they looked around and saw no one there except Jesus. Again, beginning of the story, there's this talk about baptism, and this thing happens, and this is my son, and now there's this story of the transfiguration, and there's this voice from heaven saying, "This is my son." It's almost like, again, that thin place of you don't get this. You can't get this when I can take a few pieces of bread and a couple of fish and feed thousands of people. You don't get this when I can walk on water to you in a boat. You don't get this when I can still a raging sea. You don't get this when I'm doing these amazing things of healing people and doing all this stuff. You don't get this, and now you're kind of hearing again the voice of God. You're seeing this amazing thing. You're hearing the voice of God, and it's amazing that as Mark continues the story through his gospel, they still don't quite get this whole thing. And it's this idea that they're thinking, you would think it would be easy to get. Like I've said before, how many times have you asked, God, if you would just show me clearly what I'm supposed to do here, I'll do it. And then God sometimes does it, and we're like, no, that's not, that can't be right. Something else is going to happen. So, I always, when I think about my call story, how I ended up called into ministry, I was a history and secondary education major when I was a freshman in college, and I did very poorly my first semester of college. And they told me after my first history class that I could no longer be a history major. That's how poorly I did, right? And I had one more semester to figure out my grades and everything else. And so I was undecided as a major for my second semester of my freshman year, and all I did was I would pray, God, just what do you want me to do? I didn't know anything else. I wasn't real active in my faith at the time, but I'd grown up in the church. I didn't know anything else to do but pray, and so I prayed and I did all this stuff. And God kept saying, "Oh, Steve, I want you to be a minister. I want you to be a preacher. I want you to do this." And I would say, "No, God, something else. There's got to be something else you want." And I would say, "Oh, no, you want something else." And I would try to bargain and argue with God, and I think we do that sometimes when we ask God for answers. That's not what we really want. And I think some of the disciples were kind of starting to catch glimpses of this and like, no, this can't be it. And that's why Peter says what he says after he declares who Jesus is. That's why kind of what Peter says when he's at the mountaintop and they have this transfiguration. That's why I think, so you hear the voice of God say this. And then as they continue the story in the gospel, they really don't quite get it. But this passage, Jesus' transfiguration, it gives us a glimpse into the divine nature of Jesus. It's followed by the story of Jesus healing a boy with an unclean spirit and showing the continued struggle against evil. Both of these scenes expose the need for us to be reliant on Jesus. The disciples kind of miss the glory and the magnitude and the power of Jesus. They ask to build a little big tent, and then Jesus shows their need for prayer and their faith by going back down the mountain and continuing to engage in the mission. In the other Gospels, there's this story where they say, they always talk about, no, we need to go back down the mountain. Jesus kind of explains all this stuff. Here it just says, as they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them not to tell anyone what they had seen until after he had risen from the dead. So they kept it to themselves, and they kept asking, what's this rising from the dead he's talking about? I mean, think about this. No one had ever risen from the dead. So when Jesus says, Son of Man's going to die, and in 3 days he's going to rise from the dead, they're like, what is that about? Nobody talks like that. No, who's going to do that? For us, it seems absolutely, we know Jesus did that, right? We look back on Easter and we know what happened. But at the time when Jesus is predicting that this is going to happen, they don't understand that. They don't see that. What's this rising from the dead? We don't get what he's talking about here. And I think Jesus tells them not to tell anyone when they're coming down the mountain because they don't understand and would not fully understand until after the resurrection. And I am convinced that there are just probably were times, and the way that Acts talks about the how bold the disciples were in their proclamation of that they must have, after they got done and looked about things and had the experiences, even some of the other Gospels tell us the other post-resurrection experiences, I'm convinced that the disciples probably went, oh, okay, now I get it. I didn't get it until after the resurrection, but now I get what Jesus was talking about. And I think that's important to do that. And so they asked Jesus this question, well, why do the legal experts say that Elijah must come first before the Messiah comes? So that's one of the things they talk about if you strict reading of some of the prophecies and stuff like that. In other words, we don't get what this is all about. And he answered them, Elijah does come first to restore all things. Why was it written that the human one would suffer many things and be rejected? In fact, I tell you, Elijah has come, but they did to him whatever they wanted, just as it was written about him. So it's like, why are you looking for this guy that you didn't accept the first time he was around? Right? We couldn't do it. And there were lots of different expectations about how the Messiah would come. And the disciples weren't getting really the fact that it really was happening, that Jesus, the Messiah, was standing right in front of them. They almost got it, but they didn't quite get it. And so then when Jesus, Peter, James, and John approached the other disciples, they saw a large crowd gathering around them, and legal experts were arguing with them. Suddenly the whole crowd caught sight of Jesus. They ran to greet him, overcome with excitement, and Jesus asked them, what are you arguing about? And someone from the crowd responded, Teacher, I brought my son to you since he has a spirit that doesn't allow him to speak. Whenever it overpowers him, it throws him into a fit. He foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, and stiffens up. Again, probably today this would be a diagnosis of something like epilepsy or something like that. But again, if Jesus heals this situation, is that any less of a miracle? Because we can't really even heal some of this stuff now. We can treat it, but we can't heal it and all that kind of stuff. So I spoke to your disciples to see if they could throw it out, but they couldn't do it. They didn't get it. They couldn't do it. So Jesus answered them, you faithless generation, how long will I be with you? How long will I put up with you? Bring him to me. Jesus gets frustrated at this point that these disciples are just not quite. How do you see all that you've seen and experience all that you experience and really not quite understand it? How long will I have to put up with you? Bring him to me. So they brought him, and when the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a fit. He fell on the ground, rolled around, foamed at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, how long has this been going on? He said, since he was a child, it is often thrown him into fire or into water, trying to kill him. If you can do anything, help us to show up compassion. Jesus said to him, if you can do anything, all things are possible for him who has faith. Now, again, if you can do anything is this idea that, well, we don't really quite think you can, people have told me we can do this for you. We've seen you do stuff, but can you really do this? If you can do anything, all things are possible for him who has faith. At that, the boy cried out, I have faith, help my lack of faith. Now, that seems like a little bit of a kind of a weak statement, but there's a real power and strength in that statement. I don't understand it. I don't get it, Jesus, but I know you can. Just if you say you can do it, you can do it. I'm going to help my unbelief and just do this. It's an admission of allowing God to be God in that situation. It's not a weak resignation. It's really a strength of a resignation the Father gives here in this situation that I've always kind of like that statement, because it's like I don't always understand it. I don't always get what we're talking about here, but I want you to help my lack of faith. The Father was asking for help because he knew Jesus was powerful, and I think that's times when he was accepting that power even if he didn't really understand it. Noticing that the crowd had surged together, Jesus spoke harshly to the unclean spirit. You and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. After screaming and shaking the boy horribly, the spirit came out. The boy seemed to be dead. In fact, several people said that he had died. But Jesus took his hand, lifted him up, and he rose. Now, again, we know from other stories in the Gospels that did this boy in this thing, did he really just kind of pass out from this thing, or did he die? I mean, he could have. Jesus kind of did that to several people. He raised your hand and get up, kind of do that stuff. We don't know how that happened, but either way, it's an absolute miracle. And then the disciples went to the house and they asked Jesus privately, why couldn't we throw the spirit out? And he said, throwing this kind of spirit out requires prayer. In other words, I think the statement there is you were trying to do it yourself because you were trying to rely on your power. And when it requires prayer, I think it's this, you need to rely on a power that's outside of you, that's above you. You rely on God's power, not your power, to do this. And Jesus teaches that their failure is a chance to kind of pray more, to trust more, to believe more, and kind of do that. From there, Jesus and his followers went through Galilee, but he didn't want anyone to know it. This was because he was teaching his disciples. So part of the role of a rabbi was not just to impact the crowd and people that gathered around him, because that would happen. As rabbis taught, as rabbis went through a town, people would gather around, and if you had time, you could hear and listen to this kind of stuff. But part of his deal was he's supposed to teach his disciples and teach them how to do things. And so he's doing this thing specifically. The human one will be delivered into human hands. They will kill him. 3 days later, after he's killed, he will rise up. But they didn't understand this kind of talk, and they were afraid to ask him. All right, he said it again. He said this resurrection stuff again. What? I don't understand that. But I'm not going to ask him because he's being mad at us if we ask him again. And so they didn't ask him. They went to Capernaum. They had to come into a house. He asked them, what do you argue about in the journey? They didn't want to respond. On the way, they had been debating with each other about who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, whoever was to be first must be least of all and the servant of all. Jesus reached for a little child, placed them among the 12, and embraced him. Then he said, whoever welcomes one of these children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me isn't actually welcoming me, but rather the one who sent me. John said to Jesus, teacher, we saw someone throwing demons out in your name, and we tried to stop him because he wasn't following us. Jesus replied, don't stop him. No one who does powerful acts in my name can quickly turn around and curse me. Whoever isn't against us is for us. And I assure you, whoever gives a cup of water to drink because you belong to Christ will certainly be rewarded. So here's the deal. Part of what would happen in that culture is that disciples would think, if you weren't of my rabbi's school, if you weren't following my rabbi, then you weren't right. If you weren't a part of my brand of discipleship here, then you weren't right. You were wrong. And so if you did something good, then it must have been fake or false or some kind of evil kind of plan that you were doing. That would never happen today. We would never think that about anything else right today. Just because somebody at the Catholic Church, the Catholic priest does something great, we think, oh, they're Catholic.
We got smarter.
Yes, that's right. We've got a lot smarter over here. We don't do that anymore. It's amazing to me that this stuff it's kind of human nature. It's kind of continuing to go up. And so when I hear these things talk about in all kinds of realms, church realms and political realms and other ways, it's this idea that if you're not on my team, then you can't be good, and you can't be right. You can't do good. And so even if you do good, then there's some ulterior motive behind it. And I think that's a challenge. We just as a part of our gratitude thing with us as the three pastors here, we just sent some thank you notes and some gift cards to restaurants, to some of our colleagues in ministry in other places, other churches, not United Methodist, other denominations around our city, but that we feel like are doing great things and really doing powerful things for the kingdom of God. Because we want to encourage them to do that, to keep doing those things. And because we know how hard it is to do this job and sometimes not feel like you're encouraged. And not everybody is, as I would say, is as fortunate as sometimes we are around here because of the community we're a part of here. And so we sent this out. It's this idea that we want to recognize and reward anybody who's doing good for the kingdom of God. It's not just about if they're doing it in our name. It's not just about if they're doing it like we would do it. It's if they're doing good for the kingdom of God. If the kingdom of God is growing, then it's a good thing. And I think that's what Jesus is trying to say here to these disciples. We need to learn that as well today. just like we did that. And I assure you, whoever gives you a water to drink because you belong to Christ will certainly be rewarded. Sometimes that's hard. Sometimes it's hard to kind of allow that to happen when I think that isn't happening the way I would say it would happen or anything else. But it's this idea of, is the kingdom growing? Is the kingdom advancing? I used to have 3 questions that I would ask my kids when they would say, when they get upset about something. When I would get upset about something, I would say, I want to know the answer to 3 questions. Is it going to help? Is it going to matter tomorrow? Is it going to help anybody know Jesus? And is the kingdom of God going to advance? If you would answer these 3 questions, then I think most of the things you get upset about, you wouldn't get as upset about. And I try to do that for myself. And sometimes I'm good at it, and sometimes I'm not. But I think that's an important thing to do. And Jesus says, no one who does powerful acts in my name can turn around tomorrow and curse me, can stand against me. And so I think that's a lesson, too, for us. As for whoever causes these little ones to believe in me, to trip and fall into sin, it would be better to have them a huge stone hung around their necks and to be thrown into the lake. So there's the idea that there's a higher standard of things. If you're a part of advancing this kingdom, then you have an expectation to do things and to do those things. And it's not just children, like age-wise. I think it's in our world today. It's kind of like this idea: if you're leading people astray, it's a problem. My grandmother used to love to watch all the television preachers on her TV. And one day, my mom and I noticed that she was sending good chunks of money to Oral Roberts or somebody else like that, some other TV preacher or whatever it might be. And we kind of had talked to her about it. And I'm like, and when my mom would ask me about it, I kind of later in life would say, I think there's a standard of when someone is doing something that I think is leading somebody astray, I think they're held to that. But I think if someone falls along in that thing, there's almost like an understanding. I'm desiring I may be wrong about how I get to Jesus, but I'm really trying to get to Jesus. And I think there's a grace in that for people too. And I feel a lot of pity for people who do that. And we had to kind of have a conversation about that with my grandmother. But anyway, and then Jesus starts talking about if your hand causes you to sin, chop it off. It's better for you to enter the kingdom of God crippled than to go away with 2 hands in the fire of hell, which can't be put out. If your foot causes you to fall into sin, chop it off. It's better for you to enter the life lame than to be thrown into hell with 2 feet. If your eye causes you to fall into sin, tear it out. It's better for you to enter God's kingdom with 1 eye than to be thrown into hell with 2. Man, that's tough. I mean, that's tough. I mean, that's a big deal. But and I don't know that there's a hyperbole that happens in this statement. I think in one sense, because culturally that would have been something else. If you caught in Middle Eastern culture, still even today, in a lot of places, if you get caught stealing, you get your hand cut off. It's not that, but it's this idea that that we have to remove ourselves from the things that tempt us. For some of us, certain things can be done and not be a temptation, but for others of us, to do that causes a temptation that we don't need to do. And I think we need to remove that stuff from us. And I think that's kind of what this really talks about. That's a place where worms don't die and fire never goes out. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if salt loses its saltiness, how will it ever become salty again? Maintain salt among yourselves and keep peace with each other. All right, so there's a description of hell here. That is, I think, some ways we kind of take that part of it literally, and I'm not sure if that's a literal description of what's going on there. And people have tried to explain it away by saying, well, there's this valley outside of Jerusalem where they bury the trash and they threw dead bodies and they did all kinds of stuff and the fire never went out and all this stuff. I think there's a sense in which, however we understand that, he's trying to paint a picture of how bad it's going to be. Just like I don't think in the end of the Bible where they talk about heaven with streets of gold and all those kind of things, I don't think that there's a place up in the sky where there's streets of gold and things like that. I think that's meant to show us a way in which thinking about the greatest, most glorious thing we can think of is a place with pearly gates and streets of gold and things like that, and living on the clouds and all. And it's just kind of this to paint a picture to us of a desirable place for us to be. And I think this is an effort also to paint a picture of a desirable place for us to avoid at all costs. And this talk of salt, losing its saltiness, how will it become salt again? Again, a limited description of this statement that we get fuller kind of explanations in other Gospels, and Matthew and Luke, about being salt to the earth and all that kind of stuff. It's this idea that Jesus is just saying, you have this in you. Don't waste it. Don't waste it. Maintain salt among yourself and keep peace with each other. It's not the. There's further explanation again. We get the other Gospels, but not here in Mark. And then Jesus kind of gives some other teachings about self-sacrifice and discipleship and what God requires for you if you want to live in the kingdom of God. And then Jesus teaches about God's intent for marriage, faith like a child, and independence upon Him. And then it says Jesus left that place and went beyond the Jordan into the region of Judea. Crowds gathered around Him, and as usual, He taught them. Some Pharisees came and tried to test Him and said, "Does the law allow a man to divorce his wife?" And Jesus answered, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed to write a divorce certificate and to divorce his wife." And Jesus said to them, "He wrote this commandment for you because of your unyielding hearts." So they would try to use this law, this permission that was given to him because it was the right thing that God would, and Jesus kind of says, if you end a relationship, it has more to say about your unyielding heart, your unwillingness to kind of truly love someone else, and how that goes. And I would say I am the child of divorced parents. My parents divorced when I was 12, and the Gospels all across are pretty clear about the speaking against divorce. Both my parents remarried, and I think that's I've always kind of my ears go up when I hear these talks because I want to think about this. I think there's a reason why God speaks out so clearly against divorce. I think it's a very painful, terrible situation. When Heather and I started dating, I broke up with her several times. She listen to her, and I did that because every time we got closer to be more serious, I would say, "I'm out. I'm done. I don't want to go through this again. My parents divorced. It's painful. It was terrible. I don't want to ever be in a relationship where that is a possibility." As we grew in our relationship, and thankfully she took me back, and we dated again. I started to get to the realization where that unwillingness to do that said more about me and my willingness to kind of give myself completely to somebody than anything else, and I wasn't destined to be what my parents had done. And so it became very important for me to get beyond that and kind of deal with that myself. And so I spent the time doing that. I think there's a reason why divorce is talked about so negatively in the Bible, because I think it is an absolute bad situation for all people involved, and I don't think it's good. And so I think that's why it's there. And I think it's that line is, "Therefore humans must not pull apart what God has put together. Let no man put asunder." That kind of that. How many times have I said that at the end of a wedding, right? What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. That's like, I think that's it's less a statement about you can't be a faithful person and be divorced. It's more a statement about the command that Jesus gives us over and over again to love, to really love, and how that works. And so it becomes it becomes a statement about that, about love, rather than about the divorce and how that works. Inside the house, the disciples asked him about this, and he said that whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a wife divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Again, I think this is this idea of culturally, the idea there was more, it was less this idea of, like I said, both my parents are divorced, both my parents, my dad's dead now, but this was my stepdad, but both my parents were divorced, both my parents remarried, and so this would be a hard lesson for me to hear as a child of that and think about my parents, but I think it's this idea that there was this sense in which, in that culture, a man could just say to his wife, and he was, I divorce you, and you were divorced, and she didn't have any way of supporting herself, and he could say, I divorce you, because I want to talk to this girl over here. And it was this idea of, if I discard you so I can go over here in this direction, then it becomes, again, a statement about my character more than about the situation that's involved in that. And I think that's why these statements are there for Jesus. And people began to bring children to Jesus so they could bless them. And Jesus said, I assure you, whatever doesn't welcome a God's kingdom like a child will never enter it. Then he hugged the children and blessed them. I think, again, this idea of Mark saying you don't get it is this idea that you don't get to kind of, you're not going to understand it, you're not going to kind of understand what's going on. And you need to be like a child. A child just kind of, in many ways, kind of accepts some things that the parent says. This is, and I think you need to be like a child that does that. I think that's what Jesus is saying here, to do that for us. So there's other stories in there. We won't have time to get through all of the day and all this other section, but at the end of it, I think there's this statement that Peter makes. He says, look, we've left everything to follow you. And Jesus said, I assure you that anyone who has left houses, brothers, sisters, mother, father, children, or farms because of me and because of the good news will receive 100 times as much in his new life. Houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, farms. With harassment. You don't get the promise. Yes, you get these blessings, but you're going to get the hardship time. You're not just going to get the good life. And in the coming age, eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. I think that's why I've titled this section, You Don't Get an Easy Life, is because we tend to think if we follow Jesus that we're at the top of the food chain. And this statement he makes over and over again about the many who are first will be last, and the last will be first, is this idea that being on top is not always it's cracked out to be. Sometimes when we're on top, that means we have to suffer the most. And I think that becomes a thing. So Jesus, in this section of Mark, has tried to prepare his disciples for his death and resurrection. Does it again a third time in this at the end of this chapter 10, and kind of does this, and really kind of starts to prepare them for that, but they don't quite get it. And so then, at the end of this section, in verse 33 of this section, Jesus starts to say, we're going up. Like he said, we're going up to Jerusalem. So at the end of this, and where we'll be next week, is Jesus kind of turns his face and heads to Jerusalem and goes up to there. And so that's where we'll end next Wednesday on session number 6.